Welcome to Bottled Petrichor, a podcast dedicated to discussing key topics in Islamic history and thought. In addition to a short lecture at the start of most episodes, we ask our guest experts questions submitted by listeners and allow them to share their thoughts in a safe environment. Please visit our Twitter page for feedback and question submission forms. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm super pumped today to have Professor Van Dalen with me. Hello, Professor.
Hello, I'm excited to be here with you on this podcast.
Thank you. I hope you're doing well in the midst of all this chaos.
Yes, I'm trying as much as possible. Thank you. The same to you.
I want to thank you for being on the podcast, and I think we should just go ahead and get started. But before we do, I was hoping you could just briefly introduce yourself, your background, your research interests, stuff like this.
Yes, so I am a philologist of Greco-Arabic studies, and I work specifically on Islamic medicine. So I'm very interested in the way Greek texts were read by Islamic scholars, but also Islamic medicine in itself, unrelated to Greek text. And I'm working on a book on the way in which Islamic physicians from the 10th to 13th, 14th centuries read Hippocrates and how they engage with translations and advance understanding and interpretations of those texts.
Thank you. And you're currently teaching at Columbia University.
Yes, I've been at Columbia for a year and a half now, and it's a great place. I teach undergraduates and graduate students in history of medicine and more general Asian humanities literature. So it's been really great fun.
Understood. So we'll just get started. And the first question is, before the rise of Islam, how were Greek philosophical and medical texts transmitted and engaged with in the Near East?
So before the rise of Islam, if we look at the region where Islam would spread right after the Arab conquest, and there were two empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sassanid Empire. And in both these regions, people actively studied philosophical and medical texts. If we look at Byzantium, then we have scholars in Alexandria such as Palladius, John of Alexandria, and Stephen of Athens, who actively write commentaries on medical works by, for example, Hippocrates and Galen, and use them in their teaching and in their research. And also they teach what would later become known as the Alexandrian curriculum, which included works by Hippocrates, by Galen, and Aristotle. So you can see that in this Byzantine part, Hippocratic and Galenic texts, they were really part of a living scholarly tradition, not really seen as ancient texts, but they were very important. Then if we look at the Sassanid Empire, their scholars also studied Persian medical texts that were influenced by Galenic theory, but they were also familiar with those texts themselves. There's a story about the monarch Khosrow I accepting 7 scholars who had to leave after Emperor Justinian closed the academy in Athens. So they came to Persian Empire and they were accepted there and they shared their ideas. And of course, there were texts read from many other origins too, right? There were Persian texts and Indian texts, but we can say that also in the Persian Sassanid Empire, there was knowledge of Greek philosophical and medical knowledge. So in the areas where the Arabs would later start their empires, we can say that these ancient Greek works were studied actively, sometimes in translation in Syriac, but they weren't unknown texts or irrelevant texts too. They were relevant texts for scholarship.
So thank you for that, Professor. When and where were texts first translated after the rise of Islam? Was there engagement with Greek texts among Muslims prior to those texts actually being translated into Arabic?
Mm-hmm. So you already see some translations during the Umayyad Caliphate with its capital in Damascus, but the real start of translations happened after it during the Abbasid Empire. But that doesn't mean that from the rise of Islam, all the scholarship that was happening in those former Byzantine and Sassanid regions stopped. That continued, right? We also shouldn't think that immediately everyone became Muslim in those regions, but the Christian communities that worked there, they would have continued engaging with the Greek texts, the Hippocratic and Hellenic texts that I just mentioned. And sometimes they did so in Syriac translations, because before these texts were translated into Arabic, Syriac-speaking communities had already translated those into Syriac and kept studying them. Another thing is that in Arab places such as Hira, Christian Arabic speakers would have engaged with Greek liturgy. So the text that they used in their services, that would have been in Greek too. So they engaged with Greek texts in that context too.
Understood. And so what is this translation movement?
So translation movement is a term that's used to refer to the extensive, really incredibly extensive translation activities into Arabic that took place from roughly the 8th to the 10th centuries in Baghdad, as well as other Abbasid intellectual centers. These translations took place from Greek, but also from Persian, Syriac, and even Sanskrit. And really, there were hundreds of translators that took part of this. It was supported very widely by a variety of patrons from multiple social backgrounds. And it was also actively supported by the ruling class. So it has resulted in a massive amount of translation. I have heard some critique on the use of the term movement. It's, of course, really widely used in the scholarship, but some people say, well, it wasn't an official movement, like it wasn't recognized as such at the time, but it would be a movement more in a sense that it describes a moment in history during which activities of translational activities took place.
And so what was kind of the political and social context behind all of this? Like, well, I guess what was the impetus to kind of translate?
Right, it's a complex question. We already saw that during the Umayyad Empire, some translations took place. But what happened politically and socially when the translations really started kicking off is that you have the beginning of the Abbasid Empire, which had its capital in Baghdad, which means that was a capital that was much closer to where the majority of the Persian inhabitants of the empire lived. So you now have a place where Persian and inhabitants from the former Byzantine Empire, they unite. So you have a very different social fabric of the society, as well as an Abbasid Empire that politically wants to establish itself firmly in next to the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, but also in succession of the former Sassanid Empire that had emphasis, that really highly valued its intellectual traditions, right? So it kind of had to continue those habits and customs of intellectualism that already took place. So this is also in a period where there's increased Arabization. So during the Umayyads, already Arabic became the official administrative language, but during this period, increasingly so, the elite and intellectual activities were all performed in Arabic, and it's difficult to know to what extent the full population would also have spoken Arabic, but we know that increases, and that's something to keep in mind. Another thing that happened that's important to know is the introduction of paper-making technologies from China in 751. So that means that it was much easier to produce written books, much cheaper than the parchment that was used before. So we have political change, social change, technological changes that all were important factors at the background of this movement.
Understood. And who in particular kind of initiated or maybe took the translation movements to its full form And why did caliphs and patrons feel the need to maintain this translation activity through several generations?
Mm-hmm. That again is a very important question, and also a complex question, to which scholars have multiple answers. And I think there's truth in all of them. So on the one hand, you have more of a top-down view that we find in the work of Dimitri Gutas, who explains really that the Abbasids felt the need to posit their empire in that long intellectual tradition of the Sassanids and next to Byzantium, and they needed practical knowledge. They needed astronomy and medical texts, and therefore really supported translations, even though he also said that this elite that supported translation movement was very, very diverse. But he definitely says we shouldn't underestimate the role of the elite, right? And then in George Saliba's work, we find a more bottom-up approach where he stresses the role of middle-class administrators who competed for jobs, and because they all wanted to perform well and keep their jobs, they all very actively searched for ways to translate texts and increase that demand. Now, increase the output of translations. In addition to that, we also have need to keep in mind the scholarship that existed. Previously, we talked about medical research that was being done in Alexandria. And while Alexandria lost its economic and intellectual role as a center, that scholarship continued, right? So there's still physicians and astronomers that's working in the traditions that people were already working in before these political and linguistic changes. So they now need the works they were already working with to be translated into Arabic. And you also see that in the fact that important patrons of medical texts were themselves physicians, for example, of the Bukhdishu family, and of other texts also. An example is the Banu Musa. They were themselves scholars. So scholars, because of their scholarly needs, also had an important role in the initiation and continuation of these activities. So I think it's really a combination of all these members of society.
Thank you for that. And so what was the motivation behind translating texts on certain topics, and how did the change in social and religious atmosphere engender the translation of other types of texts?
So in the case of medical texts and astronomical texts, then clearly there is a need by scholars to have the texts that they use in their scholarship in Arabic, right? To have access to that. And you also see that caliphs support that as well, because for them too, medicine and astronomy are disciplines that are important. They're practical. Now, if we look at philosophy, that was also considered very important in many ways. It even had a practical application too, because in medicine it was considered necessary to know of philosophy and logic. And also in the theological debates that were happening at the time, again, not everyone was Muslim yet, right? But there was an increasing amount of Muslims in society, whereas there were also still Christian communities, there were Jewish communities, and people spoke with each other. They were in conversation with each other, which was a nice thing. And for these debates, it was good to know of logic, right? So that also increased the need and interest in philosophy to be able to effectively engage in debates with religious, but also components that differed in other respects. So this doesn't cover everything, but these are some of the motivations.
What was the Bayt al Ḥikmah, and how has this been popularly understood? Is the understanding of how normally people understand Baital Hikmah an accurate and correct understanding?
Yeah, so let's first talk a bit about how it's been popularly understood. I think it's really been blown up a bit as this house of wisdom. It's just how it translates into English, where this entire translation movement took place and which was founded by the caliphs, and everyone worked there and got paid there. And it was this institution, almost like an academic institution today, where people studied the sciences as well, and it was really vibrant. Now, society was very vibrant and all these activities happened, but it wouldn't be correct to think that that happened in the House of Wisdom, because what we know in the literature and in the sources about this Baital Hikmah is actually very limited. Definitely the caliphs from Al-Mansur onwards, they had a library, and yes, it's also referred to as Bayt al Hikmah, but its scope was more limited than what I just described. It was a place where, yes, people worked in the service of these caliphs. For Harun al-Rashid, for instance, they also translated for them, right? Especially there's reference to works from Persian being translated. And in addition to translated, they also worked on algebra and astronomy. So what we can say that's likely true is that these caliphs did support a library where a variety of intellectual activities took place. And it was also similar to a kind of library that the Sasanian administration used to support before, right? But it was not a large central academy that would have served as the center of the translation movement. And also not a place where a lot of Greek Arabic translation took place.
Thank you. And so as we move on, I kind of wanted to ask kind of like the ins and outs of translations. How were translations being done? How did the people get the original works which were translated? And who are these translators? What knowledge did they have as it related to the text that they were translating?
So it depends on the discipline, but what's certain for the beginning of these activities is there wasn't a professional group of translators. Rather, if you take the case of medicine, for instance, you have often physicians themselves who translate, and as their reputation raises for making good translations, they will have been asked to do more translations. Some of these people knew Greek as their native language. An example of that is Gustav ben Lucca. And others knew it to some level, such as Hunayn. He was an Arab Christian who probably who knew Greek from its liturgical use. But he had to actually travel to Byzantium for 3 years to improve his knowledge of the language. And after that, he knew it so well that he was able to recite Homer. So you see that these people already started, like in the case of Hunayn, he started already translating with that before he traveled, right? And when he felt the need to learn more Greek, he did that afterwards. What he already was a physician who knew the text he was translating and the information in them. He knew that well. There wasn't a ready class of translators at the beginning. But as time went on, we know that the salaries were large, so people would be able to live purely off their translational activities.
So there's a context to kind of the texts that were originally written. There's a language, there's a culture, there's an environment, geography, and then there's a context in which this translation and reading is happening. So how did people reading the translations of things like herb names or disease names understand what they were in their own context, given that, this is a completely different place?
Yeah, so again, we need to keep in mind that these texts weren't, at the time these people were translating them, completely foreign. They already were working with them. Their fathers and generations before them already knew what was in them. Sometimes. So, for instance, they already were known. Some disease names were had already Syriac names from previous Syriac translations. So, when making Greek translations, that people would make use of these Syriac loanwords and clearly assume that their audience would read that. Or for words that didn't have an Arabic word, they would transliterate the Arabic word, and same with herbs, and then add a definition to it. So that people would understand it. But nonetheless, in the case of diseases and perhaps also herbs, but I can give an example of diseases, later Arabic physicians would sometimes understand something different than the translator intended, or the translator would have intended something else than the Greek author intended. So that's both because insight into diseases and what they refer to changed and evolved, and because of the language that's developing and the terminology that's changing.
So the Arabic of a lot of these translations is sometimes known as translationese, or at least that's how a very brilliant professor of mine would describe it. And so were these translations ever difficult to decipher? Was there a system to guarantee accurate translations? Were texts translated many times by multiple people? Maybe with someone being like looking at one translation and saying, "Oh, this is a garbage translation. I'm going to do a better job," or "You should do a better job."
Mm-hmm. Yes, that definitely happened. So someone who was known for his bad style was Yahya ibn al-Batriq, a very early translator who worked before Hunayn in the beginning of the 9th century. His father was a translator too, who was described as reliable, but also described as someone whose Arabic was broken and not nice. So I think it wasn't so much hard to decipher. Maybe at times it was, but it was mostly that the language wasn't nice. Someone as Al-Kindi, the philosopher, who did not know Greek himself, he would improve translations of this kind stylistically. But later translators such as Hunayn, they would redo these translations that they considered bad. Some translations were so bad that he would consider them unusable. Even his own, he would sometimes go back to translations that he'd done earlier in his life and see mistakes that made him want to do them again. An example I can give of that is the translation of the aphorisms, the Hippocratic collection of medical verses, which had been translated by the father of Yahya ibn al-Batriq, as identified by Oman first, right? And you see that that's in some early commentary, that translation is used, but it's then done again by Hunayn. And it's Hunayn's translation that becomes much more popular because it's more eloquent, it's better, and you see that older translation doesn't continue to be used. But as time progressed, translation became of a higher standard and expectations were raised. And as mentioned before, the translators were paid very well. So competition was big, and if your style wasn't good, you wouldn't get as many requests. And patrons also did quality checks. For example, the patron Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Mudabbir, he requested a translation of Galen's commentary on the aphorisms, and when he did that, he approached Hunayn and he said, "Can you do the first book?" Perhaps he did that because he wasn't interested in reading all 7, because in total it's divided in 7 books, but perhaps also he wanted to check first the way in which he would do the first book to see if he was satisfied and wanted Hunayn to continue because he liked his quality.
Understood. So how did people get the original works that were eventually translated?
That's an interesting question. There's several stories about it, actually, that Caliph al-Mamun, he had a famous dream that of Aristotle that inspired him to start translating Greek works, and that led him to send missions to Byzantium to go get text there. Right, they were all outside of the Umayyad and Abbasid Empire, so they had to be retrieved from Byzantium, according to that kind of story. But in reality, you can see that Batriq and his son Abu Yahya ibn Batriq, they already were translating before those missions. And when we look at Hunayn's report, Hunayn, the translator, he actually wrote a risala, an epistle about his own translations for his patron. He describes his travels in search for translations. So he searched at many places within the Abbasid Empire, in the former cities of Byzantium, such as Alexandria and Damascus, where Greek copies of these texts were still preserved. So, for example, he found half of the Greek manuscripts of Galen's Demonstratione in Damascus, but not in other places. But others he also found in those centers I mentioned. So you see that these texts weren't alien to the region. But also they were brought for example, Costa ben Luca, the native Greek speaker, he traveled to Byzantium and brought with him from their manuscripts. So as soon as in Byzantium, people started really copying Greek text again, after they also learned that people in the Abbasid Empire were flourishing. After they learned that the sciences in the Abbasid Empire were flourishing so much, right, and the interest in Greek text and the translations, people started offering a lot of Greek texts in Byzantium. So definitely that was also a source. So both within the empire itself, but also in Byzantium, these Greek texts could be found and were searched for.
Fascinating. Thank you. How did different individuals respond to the translation of, quote unquote, foreign sciences? How is translation perceived between different people?
If we respond that question looking at the time after translation, so if we look at the 9th, 10th century, then of course there's this article of Goldsheer that kind of comes to mind about how Islamic orthodoxy would have been against those foreign sciences and really see them as foreign. And that has kind of been analyzed by Dimitri Gutas, who says, well, what's this orthodoxy? And right, because that's not really a defined group at that moment in Islam, but rather the examples that Goldsheer mentions are a number of individuals that would have been kind of against those sciences and say there's no place for this within Islam and for Muslim scholars. But they were really a minority group within the large amount of scholars, among the large amount of scholars that were active in the Buyid period. And if you look at, again, the average physician or astronomer, they wouldn't think of Greek medicine necessarily as foreign. That was a tradition that was already practiced in the region, and that continued. We see al-Baghdadi is much later, but they continued this medical tradition as if that's a kind of something that's universally true. And if we look much later in 13th century, al-Baghdadi even says that, right? Even though Hippocrates is reading in another culture and another time, what he says relates to medical reality, he says, and so that's still useful for us. So for the scholars that use these texts, they weren't really considered foreign in that sense, but there were some individuals that said these texts shouldn't be used in a Muslim society.
So how was medicine practiced during these times? What was the status of medical knowledge of the human body like?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And it's nice that you phrased it that way, because it shows it really refers to two different things, like the medical knowledge of human body and so let's say anatomy and pathology and physiology, right? Human diseases versus how was medicine practiced at the time. And I think we need to see those as two different things. Like we can look in the works of Ibn Sina and Erozi, al-Majusi, we can see the medical theory that evolves Galenic ideas, like a lot of theory is in line with Galen, but also a lot of medical ideas are different from it. Galen says already at this time, but then also practice is something different. Arazi, he of course has a lot of notes of his practice. Some of them, they are in line with the Galenic ideas. Some of them don't necessarily follow that. But in addition, he also is someone who complains a lot about people not using the expertise of doctors, but instead seeing like folk practitioners and women. So apparently he felt threatened by that a bit, and was a lot of care done did people search a lot of medical care not necessarily from the scholarly trained physicians, right? And how that was practiced, we need to look at more maybe archaeological evidence, maybe literature, and because that kind of practice wasn't necessarily written down.
Who was the main, or who were the main pre-Islamic physician that people looked up to? Scientists within the in the Islamic period engaging with these medical texts.
Yes, So we've mentioned their names already. It was Hippocrates, the father of medicine, who was really considered to have written down the foundations. He wasn't considered the first physician, but he was considered the first to have really written down all these principles. And then followed by that, there's Galen, who is definitely very influential, but and considered very important, right? We mentioned the place of the works of both these physicians within the medical curriculum that was still studied in the 9th and 10th century in Baghdad and other centers, right? But Galen and Hippocrates weren't necessarily approached the same way. Hippocrates was really seen as the person who would have written down all the foundations. So even if he says something that seems to be wrong, they go through efforts to explain it in ways that is right. Does that make sense? Or they say, well, if there's something that seems wrong, that's not really Hippocrates' words. But in the case of Galen is someone, yes, who's very important, but like them, he can be wrong about medicine. And they critique Galen. Islamic physicians critique Galen frequently and disagree with him a lot.
Understood. And so, was there innovation in medicine? Experimentation with if there was, if something like widespread experimentation, surely there would be conclusions different than what is written in the text of the sages. So, how did Muslim physicians respond to this? And I know you kind of touched upon this just a few minutes ago. So,
So there was innovation, and there was experience-based innovation, experimentation. As systematic clinical trials, that would be maybe too big a word. It also definitely seems to have compared large amount of patients in different group and their disease outcomes. So he would have done something that came close to that. But definitely on a smaller scale, physicians would have looked at their experiences and based on that sometimes change their opinion about medical matters compared to, for example, Galen. An example of that is Baghdadi, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who after a famine in Cairo in 13th century sees all these skulls in the desert or in a graveyard, I don't know, where he's walking around and he sees skulls and he looks at them and he sees that the jaw is one piece, the lower jaw, rather than two pieces, the way it's described by Galen. So he changes that. So then there's Ibn Nafis, also lived in the 13th century, who improved the understanding of the pulmonary circulation. And in addition to that, there were many innovations of Galenic explanations of Hippocratic ideas of disease etiologies. Not that we would say they were innovations that were always in line with contemporary understanding of medical reality, but definitely ideas changed based on reasoning and on experience. But overall, Islamic physicians would have upheld the general framework of Galenic humoral theory. So that idea that there's four humors in the body and that balance is very important for health and disease, that would still be very central in Islamic medicine.
Understood. Thank you for that. And we're kind of nearing the conclusion, and these are kind of, I guess, larger questions. So who were the key physicians in the Muslim world? What were their works and their impact, both in the Muslim world and outside? And also, I guess, more generally, what is the legacy of this large-scale translation activity that we were talking about in both the Muslim world and outside?
Mm-hmm. So if we look at that classical period of Islamic medicine, then there's key physicians really were Ar-Razi and Al-Majuzi and of course Ibn Sina. But before Ibn Sina, Ar-Razi and Al-Majuzi, they wrote big compendia of medicine. Or Ar-Razi's students also collected his notes and ideas, and these became very important in medical education and scholarship, and they also became known in translation in Latin Europe, as did, of course, after them, Ibn Sina's Canon, who kind of, after Ibn Sina wrote his Canon, kind of surpassed Ar-Razi and Al-Majuzi, also at Tabari, in importance sometimes, often in the field of medicine, right? So his Canon becomes very important in education and scholarship in the Islamic world, and also in translation in Europe. Yes, of course, Ibn Nafis should be mentioned as well, who wrote very influential commentaries and summaries of the Canon. So Ibn Sina's the Canon would be translated, for example, into Latin, and that was used in universities in Europe until 17th century. So that really was very impactful.
Professor, you're obviously an expert in the field, and I was wondering, people who are not experts in the field and people who are interested in kind of getting more involved with it, do you have any recommended readings?
Yes, I would definitely recommend Dimitri Gutas's phenomenal work, Greek Thought and Arabic Culture, about the Greco-Arabic translation movement in Baghdad and early Abbasid society. And also George Saliba's book, Islamic Science and the Making of the European Renaissance, where in the first few chapters you'll find his ideas on the beginnings of the translation movement. And maybe for another aspect of this, the role of Syriac has really been discussed by Jack Tanous in his PhD thesis, Syria between Byzantium and Islam. So that stresses the role of the Syriac translations as well. I mean, there's more, but that's a good story, I think.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. So thank you so very much, Professor, for a super insightful and amazing conversation that we've just had. But before we conclude, I wanted to ask, do you have any projects that you're currently working on?
Yes, I am working on my first monograph. I did my PhD. I worked on the Arabic commentaries on the Hippocratic aphorisms, and I'm now expanding that in my first book, where I work on the way Islamic physicians read Greek medicine, how they read the translation that is of Greek medicine, and how they engage with that and advance those ideas. So that's the big project I'm working on at the moment.
Thank you again so much, Professor, for giving me so much of your time and for this awesome conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, Professor. And with that, I'd like to conclude the episode.